Marriage has for centuries been a legal contract between two people. Marriage in the modern United States can consist of simply going to a courthouse where two parties sign a contract in front of two witnesses and a justice of the peace. In the Middle Ages, this social contract was quite similar. But rather than a marriage be between two consenting adults, marriage in the Middle Ages was between two families, creating a social contract. Marriage has traditionally been used as an institution between families in exchange for resources, influence, and to create social networks. Marriage was used among the aristocracy to create alliances, so love was not considered a vital factor in determining a marriage. Among the lower classes of society, however, they had a little more freedom in picking their partners for resources as well as love. The aristocrats were under watch most of their daily lives, and rumors had a tendency to spread, so premarital sex was not a common venture for all, though it did occasionally happen. But when the church declared that marriage was a sacrament, all other opinions were considered heresy, so aristocrats held it under high regard. Sex before marriage was highly frowned upon for both men and women, although men had an easier time. James A. Brundage stated women had a duty to maintain a higher degree of sexual modesty than was demanded of a man, meaning that they were held to a higher degree of purity and self-control, even in marriage itself, whereas men were not held to such standards, though fidelity was prized. The church was largely involved in carrying out marriage ceremonies and maintaining legitimacy. Women who maintained their modesty and their chastity were considered the epitome of Christian ideals for women, though no woman was perfect, and even nuns sometimes came under scrutiny from fellow clergymen and women. Both intimacy and fidelity were key points to make a good marriage bond, whether they were physical attraction or not. Men among the aristocracy gleaned their masculinity through the wooing and dominance of women against other men, and men of lower merchant and artisan classes thought of masculinity as being independent and separated from their masters and superiors, and this was typically done through marriage.
As the church grew, so did marriage laws. When church officials gained more influence, marriage practices became solidified, sanctioned, and litigated through the church. One of the most influential church leaders that set forth such marriage laws was Pope Innocent III. Pope Innocent was the most powerful and influential popes of his time. He exerted a wide influence over the Christian states of Europe, claiming supremacy over all of Europe's kings. Pope Innocent III was critical in supporting the Catholic reforms of ecclesiastical affairs through the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. By the conclusion of the council, it issued 70 reformatory decrees, also known as canon laws. Canon Law 51 stated that, following in the footsteps of our predecessors, we altogether forbid clandestine marriages, and we forbid any priest to presume to be present at such a marriage. Extending the special custom of certain regions to other regions generally, we decree that when marriages are to be contracted, they shall be publicly announced in the churches by priests, when a suitable time being fixed beforehand, within which whoever wishes and is able to may adduce a lawful impediment. What this council stated is that secret marriages would not have been seen as legitimate in the eyes of the Christian church, and if the marriage was not real in the eyes of the church, neither were the offspring of that marriage. This was a large ruling factor for both artisans and royalty, seeing as their resources and riches relied on their legitimate bloodlines. Through Pope Innocent III, the institution of marriage became focused on public contracts, exchange of consent, and consummation, dictated through church officials and courts. The lower classes of society were slow to accept change and direct clergy influence, particularly by adhering to public ceremony and exchange of vows, but the aristocracy maintained all aspects of the demands of the church. Both worlds conspicuously maintained that marriage upheld consent between both men and women, and that it was carried out fairly, meaning that dowries were exchanged and all due contracts signed. Sometimes the marriage process was not always smooth, and there are numerous cases where the local church had to step in and declare a legitimate marriage or to annul one. In both aristocratic and merchant worlds, however, it was the church's priority to discern and certify that the marriage contract was not made under suspicious circumstances, that is, both parties were consenting adults, and that there have been no coercion into marriage and no previous contracts of marriage. For example, a lot of people were indeed happy with each other, but sometimes old stories resurfaced, such as a man making a previous vow to another woman before marriage, and that he had consummated that bond and his previous lover brought the case to court. Or local priests were concerned over the couple being too closely related, as Pope Innocent III outlawed couples marrying within second and third affinity, meaning first and second cousins were outlawed from marriage. These were typically the cases that the church officials encountered, not to annul marriages, but to ensure that they were legitimate within the eyes of God and the church. For the aristocrats, matters became a little trickier. Due to the susceptibility of rumors, loss of respect, and even landholdings, not many couples got divorced in fear of scandal. Divorce was not common between both aristocrats and artisans. The church did allow divorce in rare circumstances, such as a divorce from the marriage bond, where a previous commitment was made before the marriage being discussed, and a divorce from marriage in bed, where the couple was allowed to live separately but could not remarry. Although marriage was always seen as a social contract, the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 made it a religious ritual that was only legitimate through the church sanctions. As the church grew stronger, they had more power controlling much of England. It wasn't until Henry VIII cut ties with the Roman Catholic Church in 1521 and created the Church of England so that he could annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and Mary Anne Boleyn. This was yet another major turning point in the institution of marriage, but the creation of marriage as a sacrament by Pope Innocent III could have had the greatest effect on marriage even to this day. Marriage was seen between a man and a woman, and it was unlikely for them to be divorced. In fact, it wasn't until the 18th and 19th centuries that divorce became legal in the eyes of the government. The idea of a Christian marriage was to create a closer relationship to God, so in many cases this meant staying chaste until marriage, which is why women still wear white in marriage ceremonies. Marriage was also a means of procreation, which meant the illegality of same-sex marriage. But this particular law was not amended until 2012 in the United States. Many of the items and rituals that took place during the time of a wedding have become traditions and are practiced today. The marriage ceremony, for example, contains much of the same wording that was used in the Middle Ages. Today, the man and the woman stand on the same sides of the altar as they did then. The wedding ceremony of today also includes a ring exchange, and the ring is placed on the fourth finger. The same finger is placed on during the Middle Ages. Furthermore, a couple and their families would have had a large feast after the wedding, and this is still carried on in today's society with the reception. After the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, marriage as a social construct and as a legal means was placed firmly within the domain of the church, and in many cases today it still remains.